The ship was called the Throne of Crimson Stars, and it was the largest vessel Marcus Chen had ever seen in his 34 years of life. He remembered the day the Zirathi came to his colony world, their warships blocking out the sun like metal clouds, their soldiers pouring from the sky like angry insects, because that is exactly what they were. Insects the size of men with armor made of living metal and eyes that saw everything. Marcus had been fixing a water recycler when the attack began, and he had been fixing a broken pipe when they dragged him away in chains. That was 3 months ago, and now he lived in the belly of the alien flagship. One prisoner among thousands, a number instead of a name. The Zirathi were not cruel masters in the traditional sense, because they did not torture for pleasure or kill without reason. But they also did not see humans as anything more than useful animals, creatures capable of simple labor, but nothing more. Marcus was assigned to the lowest maintenance crew on the ship, the ones who cleaned the pipes that carried coolant to the engines, the ones who scrubbed the residue left behind by plasma conduits, the ones who crawled into spaces too small or too dangerous for Zirathi workers. It was dirty work and it was endless work, but Marcus did not complain, because complaining meant death, and because he had learned something important in his first week. Aboard the ship he had learned that the Zirathi did not watch the maintenance tunnels. They did not watch because they did not care, and they did not care because they believed humans were too stupid to cause any real trouble, too primitive to understand the technology that surrounded them on every side. This was their first mistake. Marcus Chen had been a mechanic since he was 14 years old, starting in his father's repair shop on a frozen moon where everything broke down twice a week, and spare parts were a luxury nobody could afford. He had fixed starship engines with nothing but wire and hope, and he had rebuilt atmospheric processors using pieces from 3 different manufacturers, and he had once kept an entire colony alive for 6 months by convincing a broken fusion reactor that really did want to keep working. The Zirathi technology was advanced, and it was alien, and it was beautiful in a way that made his engineer's heart sing. But it was still technology, and technology followed rules, and rules could be learned. So Marcus watched, and he listened, and he learned that the Zirathi built their machines the way they built their society, with rigid hierarchies and strict protocols and absolutely no room for improvisation. He learned that their engineers were brilliant but inflexible, masters of their craft who had been doing things the same way for 10,000 years and saw no reason to change. He learned that when something broke in a way they did not expect, they often could not fix it at all. This knowledge stayed in the back of his mind as he crawled through tunnels and scrubbed plasma residue and tried not to think about the home he would never see again. Then one night everything changed. Marcus was working late in a section of the ship called the Refuse Bay, a massive chamber where broken equipment was stored before being recycled, when he saw something that made him stop breathing. It was armor, but not just any armor, even covered in dust and shoved into a corner like garbage. Marcus recognized what he was looking at because every prisoner on the ship knew about the Queen's war armor, the sacred battle suit that had been worn by Valith Kra herself in 100 conquests. The armor was legendary, and it was said to be worth more than entire planets, and it was sitting in a pile of junk, like a broken toaster. Marcus approached slowly, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears up. Close, the armor was even more impressive. A masterpiece of living metal and engineered tissue that seemed to breathe even in its dormant state. Curves and angles that flowed together like music made solid, but it was also broken. Marcus could see the damage now. A crack running through the chest plate that exposed the neural lattice core beneath, the delicate web of artificial nerves that connected the armor to its wearer's mind. He had heard the Zirathi engineers talking about this, about how the Queen's armor had been damaged in her last battle and could not be repaired, about how the crack in the neural lattice was impossible to fix without destroying the biological components that made the armor alive. They had tried everything and they had failed, and so the most valuable piece of equipment in the Dominion had been thrown away like trash. Marcus stood there for a long time, looking at the broken armor, thinking about everything he had learned in 3 months of watching and listening. He thought about his father's repair shop and the lessons he had learned there, lessons about patience and creativity and the stubborn refusal to accept that anything was truly beyond saving. He thought about the Zirathi engineers and their rigid methods and their 10,000 years of doing things the exact same way. He thought about what it might mean to fix something they could not fix. It was crazy, and it was dangerous, and it was probably going to get him killed. Marcus picked up his tools and got to work. He did not know exactly what he was doing at first, because the technology was alien and strange and nothing like anything he had worked with before. But he knew machines, and he knew the feel of broken things, and he knew that somewhere underneath all the complexity there were simple problems waiting to be solved. The neural lattice core was the key, and it was also the obstacle. The Zirathi treated it like a computer, a system of inputs and outputs that needed to be reprogrammed or replaced. But as Marcus studied it, running his fingers along the delicate fibers, feeling the faint pulse of something that was almost alive, he began to see it differently. This was not a computer, this was a wounded animal. And Marcus knew how to help wounded animals because he had grown up on a colony where resources were scarce and veterinarians were scarcer, and sometimes you had to heal things yourself or watch them die. He worked through the night and then the next night, and then the night after that. He used techniques from human medicine and human engineering and human stubbornness, approaches that no Zirathi would ever think to try because they had never needed to improvise, never needed to make something work with whatever they had on hand. Slowly, carefully, impossibly, the armor began to heal, and Marcus Chen, prisoner and slave and nobody special at all, began to smile. 3 weeks passed and Marcus Chen did not sleep much anymore. Every night after his regular duties were finished, he would sneak back to the refuse bay and work on the Queen's armor, his hands moving with a confidence that surprised even himself. The other prisoners thought he was losing his mind, and maybe they were right. Old Torres, a man who had been captured 5 years ago and knew more about surviving on this ship than anyone else, pulled Marcus aside one evening with worry in his eyes. "You are going to get yourself killed," Torres whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. "Whatever you are doing in that bay every night, stop it now before the guards notice." Marcus just smiled and told Torres not to worry and went back to work. He could not explain what drove him because he did not fully understand it himself. Maybe it was pride, the need to prove that humans were not the primitive creatures the Zirathi believed them to be. Maybe it was boredom, the desperate need to do something meaningful after months of mindless labor. Maybe it was just the simple fact that there was a broken thing in front of him, and he was a mechanic, and mechanics fixed broken things, whatever the reason. He could not stop. The work itself was unlike anything he had ever attempted before. Zirathi armor was a hybrid of technology and biology, metal that grew and circuits that healed, and systems that communicated through methods that seemed more like telepathy than engineering. The neural lattice core at the heart of it all was especially strange, a web of artificial nerves that connected to the wearer's brain and allowed them to control the armor as naturally as their own body. Crack in the core had severed thousands of these connections, and the Zirathi engineers had tried to repair them the way they repaired everything, with precise tools and exact measurements and procedures that had been perfected over millennia. But the core was not responding to their methods because the core was not a machine in the way they understood machines. It was alive, or close enough to alive that the difference did not matter. And it was traumatized, and it had shut down to protect itself from further damage. Marcus understood this because he had seen the same thing in animals and in people, and even in some of the more advanced AI systems he had worked with back home sometimes. When something was hurt badly enough, it did not want to be fixed. Sometimes you had to convince it that healing was possible, so instead of trying to reconnect the severed nerves directly, Marcus started at the edges of the damage and worked his way in slowly. He used heat cycling techniques borrowed from atmospheric processors to gently warm the dormant tissue and encourage it to wake up. He applied bonding compounds from human medical supplies, stuff he had stolen from the ship's infirmary bit by bit, to help the organic components knit back together naturally. He talked to the armor as he worked. Soft words of encouragement that probably meant nothing but felt right somehow. "Come on," he would whisper, his fingers gentle on the damaged core. "I know it hurts, but you can do this. You are stronger than you think. Just let me help you." The other prisoners would have thought he was insane if they had seen him. A grown man talking to a piece of equipment like it was a frightened child, but it was working, slowly and possibly. The neural lattice began to respond. Connections that had been dead started to flicker with faint electrical activity. Organic tissue that had withered began to regenerate. The armor itself seemed to lean into his touch. Hungry for the attention it had been denied, Marcus worked on other parts of the suit as well. Not just repairing the damage, but improving systems that had never been optimized properly. In the first place, the heat sinks on the left arm were inefficient, and he redesigned them using principles from human cooling technology that the Zirathi had never considered. The power distribution network was elegant but wasteful, and he streamlined it with techniques he had learned maintaining fusion reactors on colony worlds where every watt of energy was precious. The movement actuators in the legs were smooth but slow to respond, and he adjusted them using calibration methods from human prosthetics that prioritized reaction time over raw power. He was not trying to make the armor human, because it was not human and should not be human, but he was adding something to it, a different perspective, a different way of thinking about problems that the Zirathi had never encountered in their 10,000 years of building things the same way over and over again. By the end of the third week, the armor was not just repaired, it was better than it had ever been. The neural lattice core pulsed with healthy energy, fully healed and more responsive than before the damage occurred. The power systems hummed with efficiency, delivering more force with less waste. The whole suit seemed to vibrate with eagerness, ready to be worn again, ready to fight. Marcus stood back and looked at what he had done and felt something he had not felt since the day the Zirathi took him from his home. He felt proud, but pride quickly turned to something else as he realized the position he was now in. He had fixed the Queen's armor, the sacred war suit of the most powerful being in the Dominion, and he had done it without permission, without authority, without anyone knowing he existed. If the Zirathi discovered what he had done, they might reward him or they might execute him, and there was no way to know which. Marcus thought about destroying his work, about breaking the armor again so that no one would ever know what he had accomplished. But he could not do either. Was a mechanic and he had fixed something beautiful, and the idea of unmaking that fix was worse than the fear of what might come next. So instead he did the only thing that made sense. He cleaned the armor carefully, removing every trace of his presence, every fingerprint and tool mark that might give him away. He placed the suit in the royal armory, the secure section of the ship where the Queen's equipment was stored, using access codes he had stolen weeks ago from a careless guard. And then he went back to his cell and lay down on his thin mattress and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would come and the armor would be discovered and everything would change. Marcus Chun, prisoner and mechanic and impossible dreamer, closed his eyes and waited for the storm. Queen Valithgra of the Zirathi Dominion had ruled for 400 years, and All that time she had never been surprised. She had conquered 200 star systems and crushed rebellions beyond counting and faced enemies that would make lesser beings weep with terror. Surprise was for the young and the foolish, and she was neither. But when she walked into her personal armory on the morning of the most important battle of the century and saw her war armor standing, whole and perfect and humming with power, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt surprised, and then she felt furious. "Who fixed my armor?" The roar echoed through the flagship like thunder, shaking walls and shattering glass and sending every creature within earshot scrambling for cover. Guards came running from every direction, their weapons drawn, their compound eyes wide with fear, because they had never heard their queen sound like this before. Evalithra stood before her armor with her claws extended and her mandibles clicking with rage. 8 feet of armored chitin and concentrated fury that had broken empires and would break whatever fool had dared to touch her sacred equipment. The armor should not be here. The armor should be in the refuse bay, where she had ordered it thrown, after her finest engineers declared it beyond repair. The crack in the neural lattice core was impossible to fix. They had told her the damage too severe, the biological components too delicate to survive any repair attempt. She had accepted their verdict because her engineers were the best in the Dominion, and if they said something could not be done, then it could not be done. But now the armor stood before her, not just repaired, but radiating power she had never felt from it before, singing with energy that made her warrior's heart beat faster. Someone had fixed the unfixable. Samin had touched her personal equipment without permission. Someone was going to die very slowly. "Find them," she commanded, her voice cold now, controlled, far more dangerous than her earlier roar. "I want to know who did this before the next cycle ends. I do not care what it takes. I do not care who you have to interrogate. Find them." The investigation began immediately, and it was not gentle. Engineers were pulled from their stations and questioned for hours, their work records examined, their personal communications searched for any hint of involvement. Those who could not account for their time were detained, and those who seemed nervous were detained, and those who seemed too calm were also detained, because the Queen's fury was not rational and did not need to be. 3 engineers were executed in the first day, not because they were guilty, but because they had failed to fix the armor when ordered, and their failure made the mystery even more insulting. If they could not do it, who could? The answer came on the second day, when a junior security officer found something strange in the surveillance archives. The refuse bay where the armor had been stored was not heavily monitored, because nothing valuable was supposed to be there. But there were still cameras, still recordings, still evidence waiting to be found. The officer watched the footage with growing disbelief night after night. For 3 weeks, a small figure in a maintenance uniform had entered the bay and worked on the armor night after night. For hours at a time, hands had moved with careful precision over the damaged neural lattice core night after night. Impossible progress had been made by someone who should not have been able to understand the technology they were touching. The figure was human. The officer brought the footage to his superior, who brought it to his superior, who brought it to the Queen herself, each one more terrified than the last to deliver news that seemed impossible. "A human," Valithra said, her voice flat and empty. "You are telling me that a human, one of the primitive apes we keep for manual labor, repaired my armor?" "Yes, my Queen," the senior officer replied, his whole body trembling. "The footage is clear. We have identified the prisoner. His name is Marcus Chun. He was captured during the raid on Colony 7 3 months ago." The Queen was silent for a long moment. Around her, the throne room waited. Dozens of Zirathi nobles and officers and guards, all holding their breath, all wondering what would happen next. Then Valithra began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. Sharp and clicking and filled with something that might have been madness or might have been joy. Impossible to tell. Bring him to me, she said when the laughter finally stopped. Bring me this Marcus Chen. I want to see the human who thinks he can touch a queen's armor and live. They found Marcus in his cell, sleeping peacefully despite everything, and they dragged him through the ship in chains while other prisoners watched with horror. Knowing that their fellow human was being taken to his death, the throne room was vast. A cathedral of black metal and crimson light where the queen held court over her empire. And Marcus was thrown to the floor at the base of her. Thrown like garbage being delivered for disposal. He looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and the entire room held its breath. Valithra was everything the story said she was. Massive and terrifying and beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful. A force of nature wrapped in chitin and malice. Her compound eyes studied him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Seeing everything, judging everything, deciding whether he would live or die. You, she said. And her voice was soft now, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than the roaring. You fix my armor. It was not a question. Marcus swallowed hard and looked at the most powerful being he had ever encountered, and did something that surprised even himself. He told the truth. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. I did. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The throne room was so quiet that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Queen Valithra stared down at him from her throne, her compound eyes unreadable, her massive form completely still in a way that reminded him of a predator about to strike. Around them stood hundreds of Zirathi, nobles and warriors and engineers and guards, all watching, all waiting to see what would happen to the human who had dared to touch their queen's sacred armor. Marcus stayed on his knees because he did not trust his legs to hold him up, because standing without permission seemed like a good way to get his head removed from his body. Explain, the queen commanded, and her voice was cold and sharp, a blade waiting to fall. Marcus took a deep breath and tried to remember how to speak. The armor was in the refuse bay, he began, his voice rough from fear but steady enough to be understood. I found it while I was cleaning the coolant pipes. It was damaged, and it was beautiful, and I could not just leave it there. So you decided to fix it, Valithra said. You, a maintenance worker, a prisoner, a human, decided that you could succeed where my finest engineers failed. Yes, ma'am. And why would you think such a thing was possible? Marcus looked up at her. Really looked, seeing past the terror and the power and the alien features to the intelligence beneath. An intelligence that had built an empire and held it for 4 centuries. She was not asking because she was angry anymore. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to. No, because your engineers were thinking about it wrong, he said. And somewhere behind him, he heard a Zirathi gasp at his boldness. They treated the neural lattice like a machine, like something that needed to be reprogrammed or replaced. But it is not a machine, not really. It is alive. We know it is alive. The Queen's chief engineer spoke up, his voice dripping with contempt. We designed it to be alive. That is precisely why the damage was impossible to repair. Living tissue cannot be forced to reconnect once it has been severed. You cannot force it, Marcus agreed. But you can help it heal. You can give it what it needs and encourage it to fix itself. That is what I did. Impossible, the engineer snapped. The techniques required for such an approach do not exist. They do not exist in your technology, Marcus said. And he knew he was pushing his luck, but he could not stop now. But humans have been healing living things for thousands of years. We have techniques you have never considered because you have never needed them. You build things perfect the first time, and when they break, you throw them away. We build things that barely work and then we fix them over and over until they are better than they were supposed to be. The throne room erupted in angry muttering. Zirathi voices clicking and hissing their displeasure at the humans' arrogance. But Queen Velithcra raised one clawed hand and the room fell silent instantly. "You improved it," she said. And it was not a question. My engineers have examined the armor since its discovery. They tell me the neural lattice is more responsive than before, the power systems more efficient, the reaction time faster. You did not just repair my armor. You made it better, Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The heat sinks on the left arm. Velithcra continued. They were always slightly inefficient. A flaw so minor that we never bothered to correct it. But you fixed it. How did you even notice it was there? I spent 20 years fixing things that were not supposed to break, in ways they were not supposed to break. Marcus said, "You learn to see inefficiency everywhere. It becomes a habit." I could not leave it alone once I noticed it. The queen was silent for a long moment, her compound eyes studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he forced himself to hold her gaze. Around them the court waited. Noble Zirathi and decorated warriors and brilliant engineers, all watching a human. Prisoners speak to their monarch as if he had any right to be heard. "My advisors want me to execute you," Velithcra said finally, her voice casual, almost conversational. "They say you touched sacred equipment without permission, that you violated protocols that have stood for 10,000 years, that allowing a human to survive such an offense would be an insult to our entire civilization." Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face calm. "They may be right," he said. "But before you decide, can I ask you one question?" The audacity of the request seemed to amuse her ask. "When you go into battle tomorrow against the hegemony of Axer, do you want to fight with the armor your engineers could not fix, or the armor I made better?" The silence that followed was different from before. Charged with something that might have been respect, Queen Velithcra rose from her throne, her massive form unfolding until she towered over everyone in the room, and walked slowly down the steps toward Marcus. He did not move, did not breathe, as she stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her compound eyes. "You are either very brave or very stupid," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "My father always said those were the same thing," Marcus replied. And he had no idea where the words came from, but they felt right. Something changed in the queen's eyes. Something that might have been amusement, or might have been curiosity, or might have been the first stirring of something that could eventually become respect. She turned to face her court, her voice ringing out clear and commanding. "This human will not be executed," she declared. And the room erupted in protest that she silenced with a single raised claw. "He will serve me as my personal artificer, responsible for the maintenance and improvement of my equipment. He will be given quarters appropriate to his position and access to the tools he requires." She looked back at Marcus, her eyes cold and sharp. "And if he ever disappoints me," she continued, "I will eat him slowly, starting with his clever hands." Marcus swallowed hard and got to his feet for the first time since being thrown into the throne room. "I can work with that," he said, and somehow, impossibly, he meant it. The Battle of Crimson Dawn would be remembered for 1,000 years as the day the hegemony of Axer finally fell. Queen Velithcra led the charge herself, her restored armor blazing with power as she tore through enemy lines like a force of nature, faster and stronger and more responsive than she had ever been before. Hegemony had prepared for war against the Zirathi Dominion for 3 centuries, building weapons specifically designed to counter the Queen's legendary battlesuit. But their calculations were based on the old armor, the damaged armor, the armor that had been thrown away as worthless. They were not prepared for what Marcus Chun had built when the battle ended and the hegemony's flag burned in the void. Queen Velithcra stood victorious over enemies that had seemed invincible. just days before, and when she returned to her flagship, still covered in the blood of her enemies. She walked past her cheering generals and her celebrating nobles and went straight to the small workshop where a human mechanic was already working on her equipment. The left knee actuator has a slight hesitation, she said, removing her gauntlets with careful precision. I noticed it during the third engagement. Marcus looked up from the diagnostic console he had been studying, not bothering to bow or show the elaborate respect that other beings gave to the Queen. I saw it in the telemetry data, he said, already reaching for his tools. Give me an hour and I will have it running smoother than before. This was how it began in the weeks and months that followed. Marcus Chen became something unprecedented in the history of the Zirathi Dominion. A human with status, a prisoner who was no longer quite a prisoner, an outsider who had earned a place through skill alone. He was given a workshop near the royal chambers, filled with tools both Zirathi and human. And he was given freedom to move through sections of the ship that no other human had ever seen. He was given respect, grudging and uncertain at first, but growing with every impossible problem he solved, and there were many problems. The Queen's armor was just the beginning, because once word spread of what Marcus had accomplished, other equipment started finding its way to his workshop. General brought him a weapon system that had been malfunctioning for decades, cycling through solutions that never quite worked. And Marcus fixed it in 3 days by applying principles from human agriculture equipment that had nothing to do with weapons at Alum. Admiral brought him navigation sensors that gave inconsistent readings in certain types of nebulae, and Marcus solved the issue by treating the sensors like the temperamental radio telescopes he had maintained as a teenager. A princess brought him a personal vehicle that her engineers insisted was working perfectly, but that she knew was wrong somehow. And Marcus found the problem in 10 minutes because he listened to what she said instead of dismissing her concerns the way her own people had. Each success made him more valuable, and each success made him more dangerous because he was proving something that the Zirathi had believed impossible for 10,000 years. He was proving that humans were not primitive. He was proving that different was not the same as lesser. He was proving that sometimes the best solution came from someone who did not know the right way to do things. Other humans in the Dominion began to notice. Prisoners and slaves and workers who had been told all their lives that they were nothing, that their species was barely worth keeping alive, that they could never contribute anything meaningful to the galaxy. They watched Marcus Chun rise from the maintenance crews to the royal workshop, and they began to wonder if maybe they had been lied to. They began to ask questions, and they began to push boundaries, and they began to show skills that had been hidden for fear of punishment. A human woman in the shipyards demonstrated a welding technique that reduced construction time by 15%. A human man in the medical facility suggested a treatment approach that saved dozens of Zirathi lives during an outbreak. Human children in the education centers started solving problems in ways their teachers had never considered. Not better ways necessarily, but different ways, new ways, ways that opened doors that had been closed for millennia. The Dominion was changing, slowly and reluctantly, but undeniably. And at the center of that change was a mechanic from a frozen colony who had never wanted to be anything but useful. Marcus did not think about legacy or revolution or the future of human-Zirathi relations. He thought about the next problem, the next repair, the next broken thing that needed his attention. He thought about the satisfaction of making something work that should not work, of finding solutions where others saw only obstacles, of proving every single day that stubbornness and creativity could overcome any challenge. And sometimes, late at night when the workshop was quiet and the ship hummed around him like a sleeping giant, He thought about Queen Velithcresh was not his friend, because queens did not have friends, and she was not his ally because their species were too different for true alliance, and she was certainly not his equal because she could kill him with a single blow whenever she chose. But she was something. She came to his workshop often, sometimes to discuss equipment, and sometimes to watch him work, and sometimes just to sit in silence while he tinkered with problems that had nothing to do with her. She asked questions about human technology and human history and human ways of thinking, and she listened to his answers with an attention that surprised him. She never admitted respect or affection or anything that might be considered weakness, but she also never followed through on her threat to eat him. And in the Zirathi Dominion, that was practically a declaration of love. Years passed and Marcus grew old because humans did not live as long as Zirathi, their brief lives burning bright and then fading like stars that shine too hot. He trained apprentices, both human and Zirathi, passing on everything he knew about fixing broken things and about approaching problems from unexpected angles. He improved systems throughout the fleet, leaving his mark on technology that would outlast him by centuries. He never stopped working, never stopped tinkering, never stopped believing that every problem had a solution if you were stubborn enough to find it. When the end came, it was peaceful. Marcus falling asleep in his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had defined his life. His clever hands finally still. Queen Velithcresh ordered a day of silence across her empire, a mourning period that had never before been granted to a non-Zirathi. And when her advisors questioned the honor, she silenced them with a look that promised death to anyone who argued. She commissioned a plaque to be placed above his workshop, written in the Zirathi tongue, so that all who passed would know what had happened in this place. Here worked Marcus Chun, human. The plaque read, "He fixed what could not be fixed. He questioned what was never questioned. He made us better." And below that, in smaller letters added by the queen herself, words that would confuse Zirathi scholars for generations, "He was adequate." From her, it was the highest compliment she had ever given. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Dominion, humans continued to work and to think and to solve problems in ways that no one expected, carrying forward the legacy of a mechanic who had never wanted to be a hero. They just wanted to fix things, and that, in the end, was the most human thing of all.